During COVID, nearly all students were in lockdown. They had their extracurriculars shuttered and were forced to do learning from home. And it didn't matter whether the student was in public school, private school, or homeschooled. The lockdowns disrupted students' lives, and all students suffered losses. But just how much did students lose? We know mental health deteriorated for adolescents, and we are also now learning of the academic losses due to COVID. According to the World Bank, the global toll of learning losses is estimated in the trillions of dollars. So, what should governments do to improve outcomes for students in light of the lost learning during COVID? Were students already declining prior to COVID? Is there something missing in the curriculum? What are the consequences of missing in person learning? Well, joining me now to share her insights is Paige Macpherson, Associate Director, Education Policy with the Frasier Institute. Paige, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is a fascinating topic. I have children, so of course I'm keenly interested to hear some of your research and your recent report. So perhaps let's start, I guess we'll start with COVID because that's kind of the big drive here. So what was the state of affairs going into COVID? Were kids learning well before then and kind of COVID upended things?
Yeah, so that's a great question, a great place to start because we know that there was declines in terms of student success leading into COVID. So PISA scores, for example, that's sort of the gold standard of international tests of 15-year-olds that does test Canada, breaks down results by province. We know that in Canada and in Ontario, where you are as well, that students were already having their outcomes decline in math and in reading, and we're facing some significant challenges. We already had the discussions around, is the movement away from direct instruction, memorization in math, phonics in reading, is that already contributing to the declining student outcomes? So all of that stuff was going on, before the COVID pandemic happened. But when governments decided to close schools really in every province across Canada, but for the longest period in terms of province-wide school closures in Ontario at 27 weeks as a minimum of what schools were closed in Ontario. That is when we know we can see from the data that actually outcomes worsened and that school closures almost certainly exacerbated the decline of student achievement and other important outcomes in kids, social and mental health outcomes. Likely what we can, I think, reasonably say is that school closures made things worse for kids.
Okay, so you highlighted that Ontario closed for 27 weeks, school closures. What was the experience in other provinces? I think we get the prize there, but how about the rest of the provinces and territories?
Yeah, so every province did have school closures, and some were for much shorter periods of time. In British Columbia, the school closures were the shortest, and I don't remember offhand. I think it's 10 weeks of the year schools were closed. In Ontario, schools were closed, as I mentioned, for 27 weeks. So, but what we're looking at was a period, as your viewers will recall, especially those with kids, where schools were closing, then reopening in some form, closing again. So really what we had were school closures or disrupted learning from March 2020 to at least February 2022. And I think that I should emphasize that the 27 weeks that schools were closed in Ontario, that was a province wide, that was a minimum. Everyone with children knows that the policies around sending your kids to school, if they had the sniffles, were significantly ramped up during COVID. We
Yes.
know from research that it's normal for kids to get up to 12 colds a year. They can have symptoms for up to 2 weeks at a time. So that is, they can have symptoms for almost all of the school year, and that's a normal thing. But during this sort of COVID or COVID policy times, kids were not allowed to go to school for that period of time if they had any of those symptoms. We know that there were individual school closures, regional school closures. If there was a so-called COVID outbreak, which was just two or more people in a school that had a positive test for COVID, so students did experience significantly disrupted learning even beyond those 27 weeks of province-wide school closures in Ontario.
Yes, and parents who were scrambling to work full time while arranging care at home or online learning for synchronous learning. They definitely have not forgotten the sting of those COVID lockdowns and mandates. We're going to pick up this discussion when we return in just a few moments.